Good afternoon and welcome to City Watch, or rather good evening and welcome to City Watch, a watchdog program for social, economic, political, and cultural issues here in New York City. You were just listening to Con Sabor Latino and my good friend Nando. I'm happy you're still with us, hopefully not stuck in any traffic tonight. I'm your host, Jeff Simmons, and I'd like to thank you for sticking with WBAI today. If you've had a chance to get outside today, it's been beautiful weather, and if you've been in downtown Brooklyn, I hope you made it over to the Atlantic Antic. Just looking outside for the last 2 hours, it is packed out there today, and there's been some beautiful music, so if you had an opportunity, I hope you enjoyed it. There's been lots of news this past week, and unfortunately, much of the coverage of the president's actions regarding Ukraine and discussion of impeachment overshadowed the culmination of the climate change activities, and that's been a topic that throughout the month here on City Watch and on WBAI we've focused heavily on. Over the last few weeks, if you've been listening to this show, we've had a number of local and state and national advocates and supporters of climate change activities, and I'm hoping that tonight you'll stay with us for this hour as we bring you voices from three other individuals who've been on the front lines of the campaign for climate change. We've been proud to bring you weekly discussions with environmental justice leaders from across the city and beyond about these pressing issues. And this conversation this month has really been timed because of the UN Climate Summit. That took place last weekend through Monday, and Climate Week NYC, which is a week-long series of climate-themed events across the city over this past week, and that was hosted by the Climate Group. And as many of you probably know, every fall for decades, the UN General Assembly has met at UN headquarters here in New York City, and it's attended by representatives, government, business, civic leaders. This year, a lot of youth, a strong youth presence, which we're going to get to during the show, from every country to discuss global matters relating to peace, economics, and the climate. And this past week was the UN Climate Action Summit, where it was hoped to address concrete promises by top leaders from across the globe to wean the global economy from fossil fuels to avoid the worst effects of global warming. There were some reports, though, that indicated that a number of the countries made only incremental promises, and the United States didn't bring anything to the table. That said, 65 countries, this is according to the New York Times, 65 countries announced efforts to achieve net zero emissions by 2050, and also a number of businesses vowed to abide by the targets set by the Paris Agreement, which we're going to discuss as well with our first guest in just a little while. That's the agreement between nations to jointly fight climate change. I could go on and on about all of the issues, but for now, we're going to get to our first guest in studio. As I've told you, I enjoy having guests in the studio, so I'm very happy that today we have Sameera Savarala. Sameera is a climate change specialist at the United Nations Development Program. She works on global climate policy with a particular focus on that Paris Agreement, supporting island nations and the most vulnerable and climate migration. And previously, she worked for a land rights NGO in Cambodia, the Global Island Partnership, and the Chicago Department of Environment. Welcome to City Watch.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
So I gave a little about your bio.
Yeah.
First, I guess I want to step back just a bit. How did this become a specialty of yours? How did you get interested in this issue? I mean, this is your career.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a great question, and I get that question a lot, especially now that, climate change and the climate crisis is getting a lot more global attention. But actually, back when I was an undergraduate at the University of Kentucky, that's when I was first learning about environmental issues. They have coal mining is really big there, and when I started learning more about that and understanding, the social justice aspects of environment, I was really interested in it, but I wasn't sure of the careers that I had that were available. And we weren't really talking about climate change at the time. We were still saying global warming. It was a different conversation, but I was really interested in it. And then I found a job in the Chicago Department of Transportation originally, and then Department of Environment. And I learned more about grassroots organizing around climate change. And that's when I really was like, okay, this is a big problem, and not enough people know about it or are talking about it. And because I learned of the global nature of it, I wanted to get more into the international aspect of it.
And you mentioned social justice. Talk a little about that. Define the social justice aspect for me.
Yeah. So I think oftentimes when you think of climate change, you think of the environment. A lot of people say save the planet, and while it's really important to value and protect the environment, it's really a social issue too. It's about saving people, and it's about the humans, and that aspect gets lost. And it's obviously certain communities, marginalized communities globally, that are more affected disproportionately by the effects of climate change, and that's conversation slowly coming to the fore, and it's becoming a bigger aspect of it, this social justice piece, and the equity issues, especially even in the international negotiations. That's a big aspect of it as well.
And at the UNDP, what specifically do you focus on? Talk a little about the areas of focus.
Yeah, and I'll give you some background on what UNDP is and who we are.
That is important.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah. So the UNDP is United Nations Development Program. We're the largest UN agency. We serve about 170 countries that we have offices in right now, and in about 140 we have climate change programming there. We cover a wide range of issues. Climate change is one, sustainable development, health, governance, and peace building. We're really looking across the board at development, and our priority is to eliminate global poverty, and it's no small challenge, but you have to aim high, and you have to really wish for the world that you want to see and the world you want to create. So this is the UN's arm and agency that is doing that on the ground, right? So we're working very closely with these governments.
From 170 different areas.
Yeah. So, and it's primarily what we say developing countries, global south, how you want to classify it. But, and in doing that, we look to the countries to see what they need. It's often country requests that are coming in. It's not us going to the countries saying, this is what you need to change and this is what you need to do. We can help advise with that, but it's often, what are they looking for and what are they prioritizing?
And is that also because each region has different needs?
Absolutely. Yeah. It's always tailored, right? Every region has different needs. Every country has, and even subnationally in countries, it has different needs. Even in the U.S., right? Every region of the country has different needs in terms of what they need for climate or development or whatever they're doing. And that goes the same for all the countries that we work with as well. So we tailor and customize everything based on what their circumstances are.
So Sameera, one thing I noticed in your bio is you had worked in Cambodia for a human rights NGO that focused on land tenure. Can you talk about that? What was that?
Yeah, so that was with an NGO, a non-governmental organization. They looked particularly at land rights in Cambodia because there was a lot of land grabbing happening. Cambodia actually has a pretty strong legal system when it comes to land rights and ownership, but oftentimes people don't know their rights or their legal rights. They don't know, and land is all they have. That is it is such a big asset for them, and that's a big part of your livelihood. You work off the land, you live off the land. You might not make much money, but you have at least the land ownership. And when the government or another government or someone comes along and takes it, and you're not sure, if that's okay or not, that's an issue. And that happens globally. That happens, even in the U.S., So in Cambodia, this was an organization that helped people learn those rights and actually use them in the courts to hold on to their land and understand the rights that they have.
So what I often do, Sameera, before the show is I look at people's Twitter feeds.
Oh.
And no, this is a good one. I noticed you had said on your Twitter feed recently that you remember a couple of years ago when many of your friends didn't really think about climate crisis, but now you're having a lot more conversations with people who don't work on the climate or environment but want to get involved.
Yeah.
What do you think triggered this broader awareness? Why is this happening?
Yeah, I think about this a lot. I'm glad you brought up my Twitter feed because I'm trying to work on it.
Wait, what's your Twitter handle?
It's my first and last name, which is kind of long. Sameera Savarala, at Sameera Savarala. But yeah, no, this is something I think a lot about, and a lot of my colleagues and friends we talk often about too, is why now? What's happening that's changing things? And it has been over time, and if you talk to anyone that's been in the environment or climate space working on this, we've been, since the 70s of, the Earth Day movement and all of that, people have been talking about these things, and the science was there, and now it's changing in a way of how we communicate it. I think looking from my perspective from the UN, 2015 was a turning point, right, with the Paris Agreement. Then that's when you are seeing governments come together for the first time ever to really address climate change in a meaningful way. That really heightened consciousness on the issue, for sure. And then actually when we had the recent US presidential elections, that also brought, climate change back into the conversation, at least, in terms of how the West is viewing it, how the US is viewing it, because it's such a big player and it's such a big emitter, right? A big greenhouse gas emitter in this whole puzzle. So I think that also ignited this interest in really understanding the issue.
And I know, and I want to talk about the Paris Agreement now, but I know that, and for our listeners, I know that Sameera cannot talk politically. You cannot take any political positions.
Right. We're neutral.
And so I will say that the Trump has said that the U.S. intends to withdraw from the 2015 Paris Agreement, and it's been noted that the U.S. isn't on track to meet its voluntary pledges under the agreement. I figured I would say that. Talk a little about the developments that have taken place since 2015. Where have been, in your view, some of the challenges, and where have been some of the strides?
So, yeah, I think I get this question a lot about the U.S., actually. And I think what's been interesting is there's a lot of other countries in the world that are doing a lot to take on the climate crisis. So I think we have to remember that as well. And when that announcement was made, a lot of the other countries are, they're kind of reshuffling a little bit to see, like, okay, will someone make up for that? And how will we adjust accordingly? So I think it's created some interesting conversations on where is the climate leadership going to come from? It wasn't always the U.S. really that was the big leader in that space anyway. It's the way that it's reshuffling has been really interesting to see. In 2015, so under the Paris Agreement, there's what's called the NDCs, which is the Nationally Determined Contributions, which is really the heart of the Paris Agreement. These are the national climate plans, essentially, that countries are going to use to achieve the goal of the Paris Agreement, which is to limit global warming to 2 degrees Celsius with an eye on 1.5 degrees. And now we're all really pushing for that 1.5 because that half a degree can make all the difference for a lot of people. So when these countries are creating their NDCs, right, their climate plans, they have to really think about what is the most ambitious that they can get in terms of the emissions reductions that they're looking at. And in Paris, initially, everyone made their own NDC, and no two NDC looked the same. No two climate plan looked the same. That's why it worked, right? No, you couldn't tell one country how they had to do their climate strategy towards the Paris Agreement. So because of that, everyone was like, okay, cool, like, we'll do it our way based on our circumstances, and that's how we'll meet the goals together. But they made it, every plan looked a little different because they weren't really sure how it was going to look in the future. You wanted to be a little more conservative maybe, or hold back a little bit, and only put in there what you think your country really wants to focus on. No one was sure where it would go. Now, fast forward, it's 2019. They are negotiating the rule book around it, how you're reporting on your climate plans, what's in the climate plans. The countries now have the option by next year to revise their climate plans, right? So whatever you created for Paris, now's your opportunity to increase that ambition. And that's what the climate summit was really about this week, was the Secretary General wanted countries to come forward and say, okay, we have that first round of plans, but here's our new plans, here's our new pledges to really become more ambitious and meet the goals of the Paris Agreement early. Because we don't have much time. We don't have time. The science tells us we don't have time.
And in fact, that was, and we're going to get our next guest on the line in a moment, but looking for the quote from the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and I want to quote him. "The best science tells us that any temperature rise above 1.5 degrees will lead to major and irreversible damage to the ecosystems that support us. Science tells us that on our current path, we face at least 3 degrees Celsius of global heating by the end of the century. The climate emergency is a race we are losing, but it is a race we can win." And so, that to me was an incredibly powerful message. I mean, you think about the race right now, and the question that I'll have for listeners in our second half, when I'm going to want you to call in, will be, do you think we've already lost this race? Do you think we're too far gone? Or do you think with enough of these, not just the 170 regions, but every country, every nation, if they do make some commitment and stick to that commitment, is it reverse? Can we repair?
Yeah, more not reverse necessarily. I mean, you say that, you can say it, but it's more of, you want to recover, and you don't want to go back to what you had before. You want to build forward. You want to have a new, better, more efficient and sustainable economy moving forward. I think that what you're saying about all countries do need to act. I think at the end of the day, we see that, high emitters especially, they really have to focus on reducing their emissions. But all countries do need to take a part in this. And I think one of the most inspiring pieces of this week was learning about a lot of the island countries and a lot of the lowest emitters have actually already stated their intention of increasing ambition or updating their climate plans. I forgot the number exactly. I think it's like 112 countries. When we first did this report last week, as of now, that number has changed. There's more, but they are only about half of global emissions, 50% or so. So that's telling, right? When you have so many countries, but they only represent 50% of emissions. And yet they're the ones that are saying, okay, we're going to step up. We're really going to
It's encouraging.
Do what we need to do, which is encouraging. But at the same time, you're like, okay, that's great. But then all these other countries that we really need the extra ambition to come from, put politics aside and really, do that. That's what we need to see. And I'd be curious, yes, to hear from others if you feel hopeful or if you feel doom and gloom. I kind of, go back and forth from both. Sometimes I feel really, positive and I'm like, we got this, we're going to do it. And other times I'm like, it's too much.
It also depends on which paper I pick up first and which TV station I'm watching. So we're going to bring on our next guest. Okay. Sameera is going to stay with us through the show and feel free to interject, ask questions, also to respond. And we're going to have calls in the second half. But now we have on the line Annel Hernandez, and she's Associate Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. And this was founded nearly about 3 decades ago. It's a nonprofit, citywide membership network linking grassroots organizations from low-income neighborhoods and communities of color in their struggle for environmental justice. Annel, welcome to City Watch.
Hi, thank you so much.
So I just gave a synopsis of what the Environmental Justice Alliance does. Do you want to just talk a little more about who your members are and the issues that you focus on?
Yes, of course. So thank you again for having me on tonight. The New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, as you mentioned, is a network of grassroots organizations across New York City. In Brooklyn, we have El Puente, Uprose, Brooklyn Movement Center. In Queens, we have Chaya CDC. In Manhattan, we have Goals, Morningside Heights Sanitation Coalition, Community Voices Heard. And in the Bronx, we have the Point CDC, Youth Ministries for Peace and Justice, Nos Quedamos, and Green Worker Co-op. So a broad range of groups working on a variety of different issues focused on improving the environmental conditions of the communities we serve. We work on solid waste issues. We work on energy equity issues. We work on coastal resiliency issues, air quality issues, stormwater issues, and the list really keeps going. Transportation equity issues, really everything that the communities that we represent are facing today.
And if you look at some of the legislative remedies that have been enacted over the last, few months, there's been significant progress here in New York State and New York City. I mean, the governor had signed an aggressive climate action plan in the middle of the summer. Did that accomplish all that you wanted? Were there things left on the table? Did it address all of the concerns that the Environmental Justice Alliance has had?
So my organization was part of a broader coalition called New York Renews, and we were working on passing this piece of legislation for about 4 years, and we were able to pass it in the Assembly, but it was always blocked in the Senate, and this year we really had a path forward. And so we pushed with everything. We wanted to have 100% emission reductions. We wanted 40% direct investments of all clean energy funds into frontline communities. But in the final negotiation process, those mandates, those pillars of the bill got watered down. And so what we ended up with was only 85% emission reductions economy-wide, and the rest would have to be carbon neutrality, which really allows for a variety of other loopholes and doesn't really prioritize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions on site and in the communities that are facing these environmental burdens. And then for the prioritization of funding for the communities that need it most, that was also weakened. It went from 40 to 35%, and instead of direct investments, it was left to be more vague, just the benefits of, which still has to be defined by state government. But overall, even though we have, very substantive critiques of the bill, it was still one of the most aggressive pieces of legislation in the country, if not the world. And, we're hoping to keep pushing, whether through the legislative branch, whether through regulatory processes, to make sure that we are still reaching these goals.
And another issue that you, or the Alliance has signed on to, Intro 1574, the exclusive commercial waste zones. Can you talk a little about that?
Yes, of course. So I also wanted to mention the Climate Mobilization Act. I think you said it earlier.
Yes.
Which specifically tackled the building sector, right? So we are looking at how we can reduce emissions in all of the sectors. So that tackled the building sector, that state bill tackled the energy sector, and then the commercial waste zones tackles emissions from our solid waste sector. And right now in New York City, the commercial waste zones are our way to try to reduce vehicle miles traveled for these commercial waste trucks that are the dirtiest trucks on the street. And by creating these zones, we begin to really reduce these heavy emissions. And it'll be a transformative program for the city.
And, there was a piece, I don't even know if you're familiar with this, but just in the last few hours that appeared up on the Wall Street Journal site by Katie Honan, that the bill that would create these exclusive zones for the commercial waste industry across the city could actually change before it's voted on next month, that the councilman, Antonio Reynoso, is considering taking out a portion of the bill that would require private trash collectors or carters to bid on 20 zones. I know that there's been concerns among the chambers of commerce in the different boroughs about the impact on small businesses. How do you counter those criticisms?
I think for us, we have to remember that the main goal is to improve air quality and to reduce the amount of waste that we're producing. And I think that there's a lot of folks out there saying that it may hurt small businesses, but the truth is that this could result in more reliable pickup. This can result in private carters that have better standards, both on the recycling rates, on the way that they treat workers, on the efficiency of their vehicles. So I think this is definitely a benefit overall.
And as we look ahead through the rest of 2019 and into 2020, what are the other issues that the Alliance will be focusing on, ones that public might not be readily thinking about right now, but that, that are on your radar?
I think, of course, it's going to be the implementation of the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act. It was a lot of work to get the bill passed, but the real work begins in making sure that we're implementing this the best way that we can. And then that's on the energy side, but then there's also the resiliency side. How do we make sure that we are prepared for the potential climate impacts that are coming? And one of the things that we continue to focus on is coastal protection issues, especially in a city like New York, where so many waterfront communities and industrial waterfronts are vulnerable to storm surge. Mm-hmm. So that's going to be a big issue for us, as well as just broadly nature-based infrastructure to deal with stormwater, to deal with extreme heat that continues to be one of the biggest climate impacts that New York City is facing.
I'm just kind of shaking my head as you're speaking, and I'm thinking of how often I think of these things now. And that's something Sameera and I were talking about. There's these, I was familiar with the fact that, there were different flood plains, and I think of Hurricane Sandy and how that elevated the discussion significantly. And there's been proposals and plans to shore up our coastlines. Is New York City, do you think that New York City is much better positioned now, 4 years after Hurricane Sandy, than we had been back then, or that there's still a long way to go? Oh, wait, that's 7 years ago, right? 7 years ago was Hurricane Sandy, right?
Yeah,
I
I
gotta
wish
get that
that
right.
I wish that I can say that we were better prepared today, but I'm honestly not sure. In terms of physical infrastructure to protect us, we're definitely not there. And in terms of the emergency preparedness, I think the city has made some strides, but there are still a lot of processes in place to make sure that the city can be activated and respond to an emergency like that. And one big example that I always give is the region's food distribution center in Hunts Point is in a flood zone and is very vulnerable. And the city is just not putting enough attention to making sure that those facilities are safeguarded. And that could put our entire city's food system at risk.
And Annel, as we wrap up, can you please let our listeners know how they can learn more about the Environmental Justice Alliance and how they can get involved?
Definitely. Definitely check out our website, nyc-eja.org, and follow us on Twitter. We post a lot of the events, rallies, protests, and other opportunities to engage, as well as a lot of the events that our member organizations do in the communities.
Annel Hernandez, Associate Director of the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance. Thanks for joining me here on City Watch tonight.
Thanks so much.
So as I started at the outset of the show, I mentioned that there is a lot going on in the news. And while we're talking about climate change, I always do want to make sure on our Sunday night shows that we're able to bring you the latest news. And that's why we're going to bring you today's report from our WBAI correspondent, Celeste Katz.
Good evening, Jeff, and thanks for tuning in, everyone. Protests continued in Hong Kong Sunday with demonstrators and police clashing just ahead of China's National Day celebration. The holiday will commemorate 70 years since the Communist Party came to power in mainland China. In Hong Kong, which returned to Chinese control from British oversight in 1997, police fired tear gas and a water cannon at pro-democracy protesters who gathered in some areas by the thousands. Hong Kong has been rocked by unrest since June, with protesters who say they oppose a totalitarian Chinese regime facing off against both government agents and supporters of Beijing. In national news, an embattled President Donald Trump struck a defiant tone about an impeachment inquiry spearheaded by Democrats via his favorite social media platform, Twitter. In a short video posted this weekend, Trump insisted he's running into static just because he's defending the interests of the American people.
What's going on now is the single greatest scam in the history of American politics. The Democrats want to take away your guns. They want to take away your health care. They want to take away your vote. They want to take away your freedom. They want to take away your judges. They want to take away everything. We can never let this happen. We're fighting to drain the swamp, and that's exactly what I'm doing. And you see why we have to do it. Because our country is at stake like never before. It's all very simple. They're trying to stop me because I'm fighting for you, and I'll never let that happen.
Congress opened the inquiry to determine if Trump deserves to be impeached based on his interactions with Ukraine. Trump says he was justified in asking Ukraine to look into whether former Vice President Joe Biden previously misused his influence there. Trump said he did nothing wrong by asking Ukraine's president to investigate whether Biden, now himself a Democratic presidential candidate, put his thumb on the scale previously to advance the Ukrainian business interests of his son. Biden has denied any impropriety and says Trump is trying to, quote, hijack this election by asking a foreign power to dig up dirt on a political rival. In national news, media mogul Oprah Winfrey got a North Carolina crowd on its feet this weekend with a surprise pledge of more than $1 million to the United Negro College Fund. Winfrey made the announcement at the 17th annual Maya Angelou Women Who Lead luncheon, according to the Charlotte Observer. Officials of the fund originally hoped the event would bring in $500,000 to support the education of local students at historically black colleges. And in local news, Governor Andrew Cuomo announced Sunday that the MTA will get full L train service back on track sooner than expected. After work on the Canarsie Tunnel, L service will be fully restored next April, about 3 months ahead of schedule. If that plan works out, it would end the project about a year after it began, according to AM New York. L service was affected after flooding from Hurricane Sandy damaged the tunnel in 2012. Before discussing the transit improvements, Cuomo paused to note that the NYPD was in mourning after an ex-convict shot and killed an officer with the cop's own gun after an early morning scuffle in the Bronx. Officer Brian Mulkeen died Sunday after being shot 3 times while struggling with a suspect in a confrontation at the Edenwald houses, officials said.
On a tragic note, we lost a police officer last night in the Bronx, 33 years old, police officer Brian Mulkeen. Our thoughts, prayers, we hope his family finds peace with this. He was doing his job, which is a dangerous job. He was in the anti-gang, anti-street crime unit, and he made the greatest sacrifice. He put his life on the line, and he lost it in service to the people of this city.
5 officers shot and killed the suspect, a 27-year-old man who is on probation after a drug-related arrest. According to the New York Daily News, police are investigating whether any of their bullets might have hit Officer Mulkeen, a decorated 33-year-old cop who had been on the force for nearly 7 years. For WBAI New York, I'm Celeste Katz. And now back to City Watch with your host, Jeff Simmons.
And thank you, Celeste. And actually, according to one of my sources, Celeste had mentioned that the alleged perpetrator was on probation. From what I understand, it was on probation outside of New York City, not involved in the New York City probationary system. You've been listening to me, Jeff Simmons, here on City Watch on WBAI New York 99.5 FM, streaming live at WBAI.org. Coming up in this half hour, we're going to take your phone calls in about another 10 to 12 minutes at 212-209-2877. I'm joined in studio by Sameera Savarala from the UNDP, and I just wanted to ask you your reaction to Annel Hernandez's comments a little while ago from the environmental organization.
Yeah, no, I listening to Annel was just really amazing for me because I know that was really a grassroots movement, and they've put in a lot of work to ensure that act was passed, especially in New York City. And when it comes to subnational action on climate change, that's so important because, as I was saying before, the national climate plans are not there yet, and they need to advance and be more ambitious. But when you have like states and local governments like taking that action in advance like this, it really shows signs of where that action is coming from. It's really from the grassroots and from the bottom up. And I think also just going back to the initial question you were asking before about why is this getting more attention now and why are we talking about it more? Again, I think it's just a lot of organizing that's been done that's really, forced this conversation into the news and into general consciousness. So I want to acknowledge that.
And along those lines, the youth movement.
Yes, absolutely. That is big.
And that's bringing us to our next guest, in fact, because we now have on the line Mayana Nell Torres. She is with the youth-led organization SustainUS, and was a participant in the UN Youth Climate Summit. She's currently a student at, big shout out to Pace University, where she's a history and art major, double major, and planning on pursuing an advanced degree in environmental studies. Mayana, welcome to City Watch.
Hi.
Hi, welcome to the show. So talk a little about SustainUS. Talk a little about what the organization does, how you got involved.
So SustainUS is a youth-led organization, a community of young people around the age of 18 to 29 from diverse backgrounds and identities across the U.S. who train others in actions in media and organization skills for long-term climate justice. We have a track of being a part of global climate actions and UN climate talks as we strengthen lives in bridging local, national, international movements for climate change and empowering young leaders around the world to take charge of their future. I got involved in SustainUS coming out of my first year of college. I was looking for a place to connect with other youth and wanted to make a bigger difference in stress in my individual work.
And going back to, when this first, came on your radar, when it became of interest to you, what was it that motivated you? Why was this so important to you?
So My family, I was raised in a mindset that we depend on the earth to nourish and replenish us, and always treat it with respect and care. Like my mother being a nurse in critical care gave me perspective on the lack of good nutrition and that many people experience due to a lack of access to clean water, clean air, and pesticide-free food, and which is all a part of poverty and racism, which leads to serious illnesses. As this all contributes to the mindset I have today. In high school, when I took AP Environmental Science, I learned a whole new take on climate injustice, and it made me really want to take more action in my home, community, and world to address these issues. And I was looking through my school, but I was also looking online, which is where I came to see SustainUS, and I applied to be a part of the New York City delegation for the UN Summit, and that's how I got involved in SustainUS.
And talk a little about what took place at the summit and what your role was.
So I was a part of the New York delegation of SustainUS that was about 10 of us going to the UN Youth Climate Summit. And there's youth from all around the world who were able to sit in a room with world leaders and UN officials, creating an intergenerational conversation. It may have not been exactly effective as we would have hoped, but it was only one day. But that gave us opportunity to talk to other youth and make really huge international connections and make our presence known that youth are not going to stop.
And I'm glad you say that, because that's something that Sameera and I were also talking about. How influential and important is the youth voice? I mean, look, I'm in my 50s right now, and I'm hearing you, and I'm hearing Greta Thunberg, and I'm hearing people talk about this more. How much, how influential is this, the youth voice?
Well, young people are standing with frontline communities across the world to demand that we act now, and that our voices are heard over those of fossil fuel CEOs. I think Greta Thunberg is one great example of the many young leaders around the world who are fighting for a future of not only our generation, but the generation that comes after us. Youth like Easter Hersey, Mary Kopeni, Paloma Costa, and so much more. We are forcing adults to listen to us, and we're trying to change the narrative to include youth in marginalized communities from all around the world. And I think being youth, the future affects our entire existence, and we have a sense of urgency that not everybody has.
Yeah, and Maya, I wanted to say hi.
Hi!
Actually, we met recently, and it was just really lovely to meet you. And I just wanted to say, as you know, I was more of an observer. I was also at the Youth Climate Summit, but it was also parallel with, there was also Indigenous Peoples Summit that was happening at that time, and other meetings as well. And I just wanted to say that I was very impressed. And when I listen to the youth voice, it's always the strongest. It always is the one that really stands out as very eloquent, very passionate, and it's more than just inspiring. It's actually like it should make us move to act. And as Mayana was saying, like this is not just there just to have youth just for, tokenism. We should actually listen to them and understand why they have these concerns.
So, Mayana, what happens next after the summit? Where does your involvement go next?
As a student of Pace University, like you said, my family is based in Brooklyn, New York. I will continue to show up for communities of color and climate change organizations. I'm still part of SustainUS and youth groups within my university, and will continue to fight and engage others for climate change, because it's not only an issue of the earth, but of capitalism, displacement of indigenous people, and human rights, and an issue that I care for with passion. And I really will take this on not only from the UN Summit and international-wise, but within my community and my local area.
So, I think of our president's words, and I see, and we see his actions. And, say hypothetically, he's in for 8 years. Do you believe we're going to see significant environmental strides, if we have a second term of a Trump presidency here in the United States? And what message would you want to send to the president about why it's important that we address global warming issues here?
Well, it's clear that the president has no interest in addressing the implications of global warming. He has pulled out of the Paris Agreement and global climate policy discussions. Here in the United States, there is a lack of regulation of fossil fuel corporations to transition to 100% renewable energy. And it's evident that the youth of the country have to lead the discussion, and we are prepared to do that. And I think one way that the president needs to really listen is to listen to the Global South and frontline communities, even within the United States, and let them lead the discussion instead of letting corporations lead for corporate and capitalist gain.
So, Mayana, we're going to wrap up in just about a minute. Any final thoughts on, anything else you'd like to say about SustainUS? Because, I mean, this organization, this group has been around, if I'm correct, about 17 years. I mean, this is, an international organization. You bridge international movements. There's, it's very empowering. Anything else you'd like to say about the group?
I think the group is a bunch of amazing youth, and it really allowed me to expand my thoughts on climate change and take it not only from take it kind of away from individuality and more of an international idea, and understand that there's a bigger picture. And I think we are a bunch of amazing youth who will create change not only within the United States, but also share the narratives of the Global South and people from all around the world.
Mayana, Nell, Torres, how can people follow you? How can they learn more about you and your work?
So you can find me in the media. I have Instagram. My Instagram name is Mayana Nell, my first name and my middle name.
I'll follow.
And I also have a website, curlymayana.com, where I post articles and kind of keep in the loop.
Mayana, Nell, Torres with SustainUS, thank you so much for joining us here on WBAI tonight.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, you too. So we're going to take some calls. The lines are now open. The number to call is 212-209-2877. Once again, that's 212-209-2877. Let us know what you think about the global, about the climate change movement. If you feel there's enough progress being made, you can talk about the president's actions. We want to hear your opinions on this tonight. 212-209-2877. We've already got a call coming in, actually. So, Sameera, get ready. You never know.
Oh, gosh.
Let's see. Got a call? Great. Welcome to WBAI. What is your name and what is on your mind?
Sam.
Hi, Sam. How are you tonight?
All right, thanks. I was around when the lectures were given on the first Earth Day, and they told us then that it was too late to do anything then. So all of this silly-sallying is all with the people who have money and feel that they don't want to risk it. They don't want to withdraw anything in the way of production because where will they be? Their whole life has been based on money.
And
meanwhile, what's going to happen is no one's going to be alive to appreciate anything. Simple.
Sam, thank you very much for that well-thought-out argument. Thanks very much. We've got another caller on the line. Welcome to WBAI. What is your name and what's on your mind? Hi, welcome to WBAI.
Hello?
Hi, you're on the air.
Yeah, I'm Tom from the Bronx here.
Hi, Tom.
And I'd like to say this, that global warming is really misnamed. It's global weather instability. That's where this situation goes. You never know what the weather's going to be from week to week or day to day. It's getting to be an unfortunate situation.
Tom, thank you very much for your call. Yes, Sameera?
And also, I just want to add that, and climate and weather are two different things. And I think a lot of people think that weather is climate, and climate is more of, weather and systems, and it's a broader picture, and weather is more specific events. And it's linked, but it's not necessarily the same thing. So,
and global warming, though, is impacting
exactly, yes,
the weather system.
Exactly, yeah.
Do we have another call on the line? Great. We got a third call on the line. Welcome to WBAI. What is your name and what's on your mind?
My name is George. How are you? There is a lot of speculation. I mean, there's people that doubt climate change. They doubt that we are affecting the environment. And I don't know how much proof there could be to change these people's minds. But just with the fact that we are fighting to the death over the oil, these fossil fuels that are buried treasures, and obviously pumping billions of millions of tons, metric tons of one gas or another, or a bunch of gases into the atmosphere. How can that not have an effect on the climate? And I don't know where these people can come up with this stuff that actually refutes that we are definitely having an impact, and a negative impact on the environment. And, the only way to free ourselves from the kings, the Saudis, the families of the Saudi kings, the Bush kings, all the other, kings of fossil fuels, is to go solar and get rid of that. But we can't go right back into another monopoly with another 3 people owning the solar industry and making all the money. It would be just senseless. But, I mean, I don't know where these people come up with how they can deny climate change, but also the idea that we can let these wars go on over this oil and all be safe and sound, that's ridiculous. That's going to kill us before the planet goes too hot. Nuclear radiation will heat it up enough for nuclear, winter will come in and cool it right back down. I think before that gets to that point, I hate to say, but the way it looks now, it looks like the oil wars will kill us before the climate does. But good conversation. Have a nice one.
Thanks very much for giving us a call tonight. The number is 212-209-2877. First time solar came up tonight. Mm-hmm. Is that something that is part of the discussions that you have with some of the countries about solar as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they're looking at a wide variety of renewable energy projects. Solar is certainly one, and that's probably the most popular. But I'm not on our energy team, so I'm not going to say that for sure. But actually, at the summit, there was a big announcement from the African Development Bank that they were going to make one of the largest solar panel installations in the world in the Sahel in Africa. So there are these big initiatives that are happening around solar and around renewable energies. And we need to look not just at renewable energy, but also energy efficiency. I think that's one that doesn't get as much attention.
It's a big discussion here in New York City. I know that. That
exactly.
was, I believe that Annel might have even touched on that briefly with that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I know, having worked with Chamber of Commerce that just brought in Costa Constantinidis, the New York City councilman who had moved this measure through about energy, making buildings much more energy efficient. Within the next decade. There was a specific deadline coming up. Yeah, it's a little over the next decade. So I also noticed, and I don't know if you were involved in this, that the UNDP had a number of reports that had come out over the last week during the summit. One was bigger change, faster integrated development, health and environment actions for a sustainable future. And it looked at 3 large-scale sustainable development challenges. What are some of those challenges?
Yeah, I mean, let me kind of go back a little bit to the Sustainable Development Goals, too. Those negotiations also took place and were finalized in 2015 as well. So 2015 was a big year because you had the Paris Agreement, but you also had this 2030 agenda, as they call it, on sustainable development. And countries came together. They agreed on these 17 sustainable development goals, which range from like education to...
And all spelled out on your website. That's
it's
also
all there.
Very good. It's very interactive. I encourage anyone to go to it.
Great, yeah, undp.org. You'll see all of the SDGs. The UN, we use a lot of acronyms, so it's just a constant alphabet soup. But the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and within each of these Sustainable Development Goals, you have specific targets. So under the health goal, you might have a specific, target that you would like to reach, that we're trying to reach globally, and all countries are feeding into that, right? So. Of those 17, climate is actually its own as well. It's SDG 13. I don't know if that makes it unlucky or what, but it's SDG 13.
I'm making it lucky.
Yeah, and but really the discussions on climate for the UN are under the Paris Agreement. It's not really discussed as such under the SDGs, but it is a part of it, and they're all integrated, right? If you are looking for a sustainable future, you need to have the health piece. You need to have the environment piece, land, water, agriculture, considering women's empowerment and girls' education. And all these components all put together are really integral to that. And so that's something that UNDP and the UN is really focused on.
And it's so fascinating because you just mentioned areas that people might not necessarily connect with climate change.
Yeah. No, and that's something we're trying to do as well, is really link the two. Unfortunately, when it was created, they kind of move in parallel. So there's the SDGs, there's the NDC, the climate plans and the Sustainable Development Goals. And how do you link them up? If you have the way climate change is moving, if you have a warming world, that's going to really hinder those development gains you've made in all those sectors and all those areas. But if we do meet those those Sustainable Development Goals, we have a future that can actually take on the climate crisis. So it's all linked, it's all connected. I know Project Drawdown, I don't know if you've heard of Project Drawdown. Yeah. They look at some of the biggest solutions on climate change, and they kind of quantify it to emissions. And it's not always just renewable energy. One of the solutions was educating and empowering women and girls. It actually has a huge effect on climate overall. And food waste is another one that a lot of people don't think about. Energy efficiency.
I know in the city this has come up. Food waste. The New York City Council speaker had brought up a whole food action plan with one of our Brooklyn council members, Rafael Espinal, and food waste was key in that as well.
Yeah. Also, indigenous communities' land rights and actually allowing them to be stewards of land. I believe they have the land that they cover right now is about 80% of global biodiversity that they protect. I mean, it's really important that we're connecting the dots on all of these issues.
What does it mean to scale up climate action? I've heard the phrase "scale up."
Yeah, and when we say that, typically, I mean, when you're saying increasing your ambition and scaling up, it's usually what you're doing to reduce your greenhouse gas emissions, really have those reductions in place. It can be very ambitious. It could be a full 100% renewable energy by a certain time, or it could be gradual over time. One of the pieces of the Paris Agreement is every 5 years countries update their NDCs. And it's not like they have to be more ambitious, but that's the goal, is ultimately you are building on that. You are scaling up every time so that you can meet that goal.
One of the things that I want to go back to early in the conversation, you talked about what some of the countries have done that seems to be encouraging. I don't know if you can say this. I'm putting you on the spot here. Mm-hmm. Were there countries that really impressed you with how far they've come since the Paris Agreement or since these goals were set, that they're going to be amending them, as you're noting, because they've already gotten to those points earlier than expected that they had hoped to?
Yeah,
it's a long-winded question.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, that goes back to the point I was making earlier about a lot of the island countries, some of the most vulnerable countries, some of the lowest emitting countries, what we call the least developed countries, but really it's just the countries that have the least resources. They are stepping up. I mean, I think Samoa has this 100% renewable energy target, and oftentimes people say, oh, well, they're small countries, they can do it, it's easier, it'd be different for other countries. And that's not necessarily true, because every country has its own process, its own government, its own bureaucracy, its own, whatever it needs to go through to get these policies in place and enacted. And on top of that, a lot of those countries are very vulnerable to climate change. So if you have a country that's, devastated by a disaster, by a hurricane, that really takes them back, and that, it forces them to really work around something that's really damaged, right? So it's not just easy for the smaller countries necessarily, and they're leading.
So we've got just about 3 minutes left. As we wrap up, Sameera, is there anything else you want to tell our listeners about what's on the horizon for the UNDP?
Yeah, so in terms of climate, what we're really looking at now is ambition, right? So we have pledged to support 100 countries on enhancing their climate plans. So we're already in the process of having discussions with governments and determining exactly how we're going to do that. But that's something that we've already kind of been doing, and now we've really made it as a stronger commitment to us doing that. So the UN system is also doing its part. Right now, all eyes are on COP25. It's the next climate change conference. Every year they meet, just like in Paris. They meet every year. Governments meet to discuss the next round of negotiations on the Paris Agreement. So this one will take place in Santiago, Chile, the first 2 weeks of December.
You knew I was going to ask that next.
Mm-hmm, yeah, that's when it's happening. And that's where now, after the summit took place, we can kind of now see, okay, this is what happened at the summit. This is what governments pledged. What can we really get out of Chile? How can we really make them move a little bit more not even a little bit more, a lot more. We don't have time.
And once again, what is the website people should go to?
Just UNDP.org.
Sameera, Savarala, thank you so much for joining me in studio. I want to also thank our other guests, Annel, Hernandez, and Mayana, Nell, Torres. Please stay with WBAI. I'll be back this Thursday at 5 o'clock for Driving Forces, and again next Sunday, where my focus on City Watch is going to be an exploration of mental health issues, and one of our guests is New York City Council member Donovan Richards. And coming up in October on Driving Forces, we'll also have Bronx Borough President Ruben Diaz Jr. here in studio, and also New York State Assembly member Catalina Cruz will be here in studio as well, talking about a book that she's profiled, and we're going to have the author in here as well. So we've got a lot in store over the next few weeks, and also our fundraising drive begins in just a few days. So if you missed any part of this show, visit us at WBAI.org, go to programs, then archives. The show will be up in 10 minutes. Thank you so much, and have a great evening.
Thanks.